Alright, my project will be exploring the origins of the American probation system, how it was founded by the work of a remarkable man by the name of John Augustus, and how the Temperance movement and Second Great Awakening played a central role in shaping probation. The reason I was interested in looking into probation is that ever since coming to Sattler, one of the questions that I've personally wrestled with a lot is what relationship Christians should have to justice. How do we balance Christ's call to mercy with the responsibility to respect the state's duty to wield the sword? And is there a place for Christians to cooperate with the civil justice system, or should they try and separate themselves from it as much as possible? As such, when I learned that probation was originally founded by a Christian as a form of social ministry, I thought investigating that history on probation would be a fruitful way to explore how Christians in the past have worked through these issues. Now, first off, to define some terms, probation is a system of punishment whereby instead of being sent to prison, an offender is instead placed under the surveillance of a probation officer and given a set of rules to follow for a select period of time. If the offender abides by these rules and does not repeat their crimes, they are considered to have served their sentence. However, if they violate the conditions of their probation, they can be imprisoned and their original sentence extended. So it more or less functions as a sort of monitored second chance. And ideally, the probation officer will work with the offender to help prevent them from slipping back into their previous misbehavior. Now, as for prior research on the origins of probation, just about all scholars will universally point to this man, John Augustus, as the founder of the practice of probation. And given that John Augustus was himself a Christian, it is undeniable that Christian ideas contributed heavily to the creation of probation. However, there's been a trend in recent scholarship for the last 30 or so years which has sought to downplay the significance of Christianity, arguing that other ideological or social trends were most significant in creating probation. One example of this trend can be observed in a 1995 article called From Augustus to the Progressives by Professor Edward W. Sia. In his article, Sia argues that the primary factors influencing the development of probation were Enlightenment ideals, which held a higher view of human value and dignity and thus sought to reduce the harshness of punishment. Now, Sia does recognize the significance of Christian ideas, but he thinks that they were supplementary to this trend that was established by the Enlightenment. However, he doesn't really support this claim by heavily connecting Augustus with these Enlightenment ideas. Another example of this trend comes from a book by an English criminal law professor, Maurice Van Stone, Supervising Offenders in the Community. In his book, Van Stone similarly acknowledges the significance of Augustus and the humanitarian tendencies of Christians, but also argues that probation itself was simply part of an ongoing trend of reducing the harshness of punishments in order to justify an increased carceral power of the state, that is, increased power of the state to punish. While it can't be denied that these were factors that were present in the development of probation, they fundamentally fail to answer the questions of why John Augustus himself started probation. If he is the father of probation, then I think the factors that motivated him to create probation should be considered the most foundational. So, in my project, I sought to correct this oversight by specifically focusing on Augustus and what led him to create probation. I started my research by looking at what various scholars had said about him, finding out what primary sources were out there written about his life, and there were fewer than I had hoped. But from that, I was able to gain a good picture of what individuals and influences shaped his own beliefs, and then by looking at the history of those individuals and influences, I was able to gain a better picture of the social trends that motivated him to create probation. And after this research, I have concluded that probation was created as a direct product of the Temperance movement and the Second Great Awakening. My three reasons for putting forward this conclusion are that, firstly, The Temperance movement and Second Great Awakening established the ideological foundation upon which probation was built. Secondly, Augustus's work with probation started out as a temperance-focused outreach aimed at rehabilitating alcoholics. Lastly, the Prohibition era of temperance created the necessary conditions for probation to establish itself in the federal justice system. Now, to start off with my first point, probation, like any kind of system of punishment, is rooted in a particular legal philosophy. Probation specifically requires the view that crime can be a product of harmful social conditions as well as moral choice, and that, almost like a disease, if these underlying conditions can be treated, then criminals can be rehabilitated and prevented from further crime. This view necessitates that each offender be seen as a distinct individual and judged based on their unique circumstances. And while the Temperance movement and Great Awakening didn't necessarily create these ideas, they helped to nurture these ideas into a rehabilitative philosophy that could be practically applied. Now, from a legal perspective, probation has its roots in the medieval common law practice of recognizance, whereby offenders, or one willing to be responsible for them, would provide a bail payment in exchange for delayed sentencing. The offender, if they behaved well and returned to the court when summoned, would receive a diminished sentence and the bail money would be returned. While this practice clearly demonstrates the degree of mercy and individualized justice and is the basis of Van Stone's claim of a system of reducing the harshness of punishments, it can't really be viewed as indicating a system of rehabilitation. The dominant legal philosophy at that time was punitive, believing that harsh, uniform punishments could be used to deter further crimes as a sort of invoking fear of the law. The judges that practiced recognizance often did so because they viewed the demands of the prescribed laws as too severe and that it would be excessive force to punish minor crimes so severely. So while this was the initial seed that would grow into probation, at that time it lacked the ideological foundation to produce a more systemic change. That systemic change would be promoted by the Temperance movement. Now, the Temperance movement started in 1784 when founding father and prominent American physician Benjamin Rush began advocating for abstinence from distilled spirits, a class of strong alcoholic drink that was popular in America at the time. In a pamphlet he published titled An Inquiry into the Effects of Ardent Spirits on the Body and Mind, Rush argued that distilled spirits were highly damaging to one's physical health and harmful to one's moral faculties. Rush also advocated for harsh punishments for those guilty of drunkenness, reflecting the heavily punitive philosophies of justice at the time. However, despite Rush's prominent status in American society, few people heeded his calls for temperance, simply because drunkenness was not seen as a major issue in society at large. At the time, alcoholic drinks were considered a major part of American culture. They were widely seen as beneficial to one's health and an essential component of social gatherings. Additionally, drunkenness, while not uncommon, was widely seen as a private problem, owing to the fact that socially regulated drinking culture meant that instances of intoxication occurred in a private setting. Additionally, early Americans lacked a concept of alcohol addiction, meaning that drunkenness was regarded as stemming from innate human sinfulness, and thus the fault of the drinker. As a result of Rush's pamphlet, a few early temperance societies did start to form and try and promote abstinence, but none of them called for total abstinence of distilled spirits. They mainly focused on abstaining in private settings, and they didn't really gain a lot of traction at the time. It wouldn't be until the famous speakers of the Second Great Awakening took up the temperance call that the movement gained a lot of traction. The most significant of these was Lyman Beecher, who in 1825 delivered his famous 6 sermons on intemperance. In these sermons, Beecher reprised Rush's arguments, giving an extensive discourse on the destructive nature of distilled spirits, declaring that they destroyed one's physical health, mental acuity, and moral capacity. Beecher declared that the only way to avoid these dangers was to abstain from drinking entirely, providing one of the first articulations of a notion of addiction, whereby anyone, if they engaged in drinking long enough, would become addicted to the substance. With this idea of addiction now forming, Beecher promoted a more sympathetic view of drunkards, viewing them more as fallen brethren who had been ensnared in a trap they couldn't escape. Drunkenness was still regarded as sinful, but it was no longer purely a personal issue. Instead, the society around them shared part of the blame for creating the conditions that led these people into alcoholism. And this idea of society as being partially responsible for leading people into these paths of misbehavior was one of the crucial key components in the rehabilitative philosophy. Now, Beecher's sermons caused the temperance movement to explode in popularity as various religious organizations in the Second Great Awakening started taking up the cause. A number of temperance societies formed, and they spread Beecher's sermons in their own publications across the nation, such as the American Temperance Society. And while these societies were forming, they also began seeking directly to work with alcoholics and try and rehabilitate them. This direct contact with alcoholics gave them a better appreciation of just how powerful the addiction could be, which led the temperance movement towards something called teetotalism, which was complete abstinence from all alcoholic beverages, distilled, fermented, or otherwise. This shift towards teetotalism and towards trying to help alcoholics rehabilitate would eventually birth the Washingtonian Total Abstinence Society in 1840. This new society was founded by a group of 6 alcoholics who, upon hearing a sermon, decided to give up all alcoholic drinks and commit themselves to helping others who struggled with alcohol addiction gain freedom. Often considered a forerunner to the Alcoholics Anonymous movement, the Washingtonians, in addition to having their members sign a pledge to give up alcohol, started the practice of sharing their personal stories of how alcohol had negatively impacted their lives, how they'd gotten sober, and how that had changed things for them. This practice of sharing stories brought an increased individualized view that saw each alcoholic as unique with special circumstances and special needs, which was again another crucial component in the rehabilitative philosophy. However, the Washingtonian movement did more than just share stories. They actively sought to try and address the societal issues that led people to drunkenness. They created social spheres independent from taverns where people could meet with each other without the temptation of drinking, and they even used the money provided by membership fees to help support their members when they fell on hard times. Finally, the Washingtonian movement, in addition to completely embodying the rehabilitative ideals that had developed within the temperance movement, directly inspired the founder of Probation, John Augustus himself. Now, as for John Augustus, he was an incredibly fascinating man that tantalizingly little is written about. What I can say about his past is that he was born likely outside of wedlock in 1874 in Woburn. He wasn't baptized until he was an adult, which indicates, especially since in this region Puritans had a view of infant baptism, that he likely grew up outside the regular community support structures of the time, which likely influenced his later philanthropic tendencies. Additionally, in 1813, the year he was baptized, his wife and his infant daughter were baptized along with him. However, unfortunately, they both died in that same year. 4 years later, Augustus would marry again, and once again he suffered the loss of an infant daughter. However, the 2 sons he had with his new wife appear to have survived into adulthood. Sometime between 1827 and 1830, Augustus moved to the city of Boston and established a shoemaker shop on 5 Franklin Avenue, just a quarter mile away from Faneuil Hall, which is significant because when the Washingtonian movement expanded into Boston, they did so with a major public event at Faneuil Hall, right near Augustus's place of business. Additionally, we know that Augustus was already interested in the temperance movement because he writes about, he briefly mentions his associates with men like Moses Grant and Samuel Kirkland Lathrop, who were both members of the Brattle Street Congregational Church and members of the Massachusetts Temperance Society. Now, with this predisposition towards temperance, Augustus was immediately impressed by the Washingtonians and decided to try out their methods for himself. After conversing with a man Augustus met at court who had been convicted of being a drunkard and would be sentenced to prison, Augustus decided that perhaps if he could be spared imprisonment, he could have a genuine shot at being rehabilitated. So, leaning on the legal precedent of recognizance, Augustus convinced the judge to release the man into his care, and Augustus provided the bail. After which, Augustus had the man sign the Washingtonian abstinence pledge. After 3 weeks, the man returned before the judge, and the judge was so impressed in the change in the man's demeanor and lifestyle that he released the man with a token fine of a single cent, and Augustus was returned his bail money. Encouraged by the success of this little experiment, and by the and further encouraged by his associates in the Massachusetts Temperance Society, such as Lathrop, Augustus resolved to continue his efforts, and by the end of the year, he'd bailed a total of 17 drunkards in this manner. He would continue to expand his efforts from there, abandoning his shoemaker's business and coming to rely entirely on donations so that he could dedicate all of his time to his probation work. Eventually, he would expand from helping drunkards, and he would aid men, women, and children guilty of a number of different crimes, from drunkenness to prostitution to theft. However, Augustus always limited his efforts to first-time offenders. He never worked with perpetrators of more violent crimes such as murder. Also, Augustus did more for his probationers than simply leverage legal traditions like bail and recognizance. After carefully selecting those he would offer probation services to by determining whether or not he felt they were genuinely willing to rehabilitate, Augustus, following the Washingtonian model, would seek to try and address the underlying factors that had led his probationers down these unfortunate paths. He would help them find jobs, he'd help them find housing if they didn't have any, and he would also try and get his probationers connected with various charitable societies that could help them in their rehabilitation. Due to his close attention to his probationers, Augustus was incredibly successful, and the vast majority of those he probationed were able to meet their bail before the judge. Augustus would continue his work in this manner until his death at the age of 75 in 1859, by which point he'd provided bail for more than 1,900 individuals, with a total amount of bail he paid equaling roughly $9 million in today's money, although a significant portion of that money would have been returned to him due to how many of his probationers met bail. Due to the success of Augustus's methods, Massachusetts state was quick to adopt similar methods and officially incorporate them into the legal system. In 1869, Massachusetts began employing visiting agents to aid volunteers who had continued Augustus's work, and by 1880, Massachusetts became the first state to formally pass probation legislation, allowing cities to hire their own probation officers. From there, the practice of probation spread so that by 1925, every single state in America had some form of official probation service, although the majority of these was targeted specifically at juveniles. Now, from the beginning, it's clear that Augustus was motivated by a belief in Christian charity, and he talks in his account of his own works about a sort of practiced preaching that took Christ's commands to go to the highways and byways and literally went out to help people who were less fortunate. And because his work started out as a method of reclaiming alcoholics, you can see how the temperance movement directly initiated his probation work, out of which it grew into a broader rehabilitative system. However, while the states were quick to adopt probation, the federal justice system proved far more reluctant. When federal judges started to employ informal probation, The Supreme Court ruled in 1917 that they did not have the authority to suspend sentences and put a stop to the practice. In response, several attempts were made to try and pass official probation legislation, but the federal government remained opposed to the rehabilitative philosophy despite its popular support amongst the states. And this is where the final mark of the temperance movement is found on probation, as it was the Volstead Act, as you might know it as Prohibition, the ultimate culmination of the temperance movement that created the ideal conditions for federal probation to be established. Now, just going back a brief bit to the 1800s, despite the Washingtonians' rapid growth, their movement proved to be very short-lived and had died out by 1860, largely due to a fact that the temperance movement, motivated by teetotalism, had started pushing more and more heavily for government intervention and legal enforcement of abstinence from alcohol. This push towards government enforcement also alienated a lot of the religious groups that had provided the early support for temperance, which further secularized the temperance movement and caused it to almost entirely abandon attempts to rehabilitate alcoholics. Despite that, the movement continued to grow in strength, and by 1919, the 18th Amendment was passed, which banned the production, sale, and transportation of alcohol. Shortly after, the Volstead Act was passed, which established the definition of violations of the 18th Amendment. As you can see, it's a very steep definition of what constitutes alcohol, and they also imposed incredibly harsh punishments for those who violated, severe fines and even imprisonment. As such, the Volstead Act demonstrates sort of a remaining vestige of that earlier punitive philosophy of justice, which viewed harsh punishments as deterrents. As a result of this, the proponents of the Volstead Act were directly responsible for opposing the early attempts at probation legislation, as they believed probation could be used to give sympathetic judges a chance to avoid enforcing the Volstead Act. However, the Volstead Act would ultimately end up helping probation, because when the Volstead Act was passed, it created a drastic increase in the number of federal crimes, and thus federal criminals. At the time, the federal probation system was already suffering from a lack of facilities and an overhousing crisis. So when Prohibition was passed, it completely pushed the federal prison system over the edge. Probation, as an alternative to imprisonment, provided a natural and effective solution to punish violators of the Volstead Act, while also helping to alleviate the stress on the prison system. And as a result, in 1825, the first Federal Probation Act was passed. Furthermore, once federal probation was established, even though the initial act was handicapped by underfunding and insufficient manpower, it proved to be a highly effective method of enforcing the Volstead Act, because judges could use it to provide a less serious but still a strong warning to violators of the act. However, they also proved that probation wasn't simply a license for crime, as following Augustus's example, first offenders were frequently given probation, but repeat offenders were rarely given probation, showing that it didn't simply just become a license for crime to spread and actually helped reduce the spread of crime. As a result of proving itself as an effective system of punishment and remaining in high demand, the Federal Probation Act was amended in 1913 to help fix some of its earlier weaknesses and more firmly establish probation in the federal legal system. Now, hopefully, I've convinced you all that the temperance movement and Second Great Awakening were truly central in establishing probation. These two movements together provided the philosophical foundations upon which probation was built. The founder of probation himself, John Augustus, was motivated by Christian ideals and by his commitment to the temperance movement to found his probation work, which he expanded outwards from there. And finally, if it weren't for the questionable decision of the Volstead Act and Prohibition era, probation probably never would have had the chance to prove its value when the legislature at the time was so hostile to rehabilitative philosophy. Ironically, while the Volstead Act was repealed in, I think, 1933, pretty much ending the temperance movement and making it appear as though it had accomplished nothing in the way of permanent change, probation remains enshrined in our state and federal legal systems, making it the most enduring legacy of the temperance movement. Now, as for where we should go for here, I found John Augustus's work incredibly inspiring as a demonstration of just what the good one man can do when he's faithful to serve Christ by serving his community. And as Christians seeking to spread the peaceful revolution of Christ, I think Augustus's story is especially informative of ways that we can do exactly that. Now, as for future research on the topic, my thesis is largely limited in the scope to probation's very earliest days and its incorporation into the federal system. I think another area that could provide a very fruitful discussion on the origins of probation would be to look at its incorporations in the various states and what religious and cultural ideas influenced those systems and how that resulted in their differences.